Nice. All right, then I think we're ready to start. So today we're going to talk a little bit about economics, and this is very much so a general introduction to economics and what you should know if you don't study economics or just generally struggle with econ debates and how to conceptualize economics in a way that makes it tangible for debates and something that you can actually use. So I know for people who are not economic students, economic debates can just generally seem very scary. So let's try to tackle some of that and make it a lot more accessible, because I promise to you, even the speakers who sound really confident when they talk about econ, it's very simple concepts, or it's just them pretending to know a lot of things. So we can very easily get you up to speed on some pretty good things. So this is like classic econ. So economics 101, we could potentially have like economics 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 also. Talk to Marcus if you really want more after this session. But just to tell you, there is a lot more to go through. I'll just cover the most basic concepts that are helpful. And if you want more resources, there are some really, really good videos by the Manchester Debating Union on YouTube also. But today we've done the brainstorm already. That was quick. I'll cover some basic concepts, talk about monetary and fiscal policies. I'll have a little bit about the historical background for economics and the way we understand it today. We'll talk about banks, and then some like quick notes on cycles and timeframes. If you have questions along the way, just type it in the chat, shout at Marcus. He will tell me to be quiet and answer your questions instead. You can also keep it for the end, whatever you prefer. Concepts first and all. So I'm not going to ask you as directly, but you can think about it for like 5 seconds. Do you know what this is? Good. That was like 5 seconds in my brain. This is a pretty basic demand and supply graph. So basically, you have the demand curve and you have the supply curve. Note that demand decreases as quantity increases, or as price decreases, right? So you have a higher quantity demanded when the price is lower. That's the basic way of understanding things. So if, let's say, X cost 10 euros, then very few people will probably buy an egg. But if an egg costs 1 cent, then more people would want to buy that egg. So the demand for that egg would be higher. Now, the way that supply works is kind of the opposite, because you don't want to supply, aka produce eggs, if you can only sell them for 1 cent. But if you can sell an egg for $10, you would be very inclined to produce a lot of eggs, because that would mean you can make a lot of money, right? From the business perspective. So basically, the demand and supply curves, or the demand and supply functions, seek to find what we call an equilibrium. So that's a big blue spot in the middle. That means that is the point of which both consumers and suppliers are happy with the price and the quantity that is being supplied and demanded. So that basically just means the reason that eggs essentially cost what they cost is because that is a price where producers can still make money and people can still afford to buy the eggs. So it's pretty simple, and it's something we see all the time, right? It's like a pretty basic understanding of why price is the way the price is, and why consumption is the way consumption is. This X is a very basic example, but also think specifically about luxury goods and how there are a lot fewer of them, but the price is a lot higher also. So the equilibrium is a very different place in that graph. Great. Just very briefly so you know what it looks like. Moving on to this one. So as I said, we talked a little bit about the equilibrium, but another point that's quite relevant when we talk about demand and supply is what we call price elasticity. So this basically means how vulnerable are we to price changes of that good? That determines how elastic the price is of that good. So for instance, things that we are very vulnerable to the price changes of are things where we can exchange them for other goods. So imagine that you typically buy a lot of fruit, and now fruit becomes really expensive and nothing else becomes much more expensive, then you would probably just not buy the same amount of fruit, right? Because you could probably just buy vegetables instead, or candy, or whatever you exchange fruit with. On the other hand, if you are somewhere where you need to buy water, if water becomes a lot more expensive and you don't have access to anything else, like liquids that could satisfy your thirst, you would still be buying water, because in that sense, the price elasticity of water is quite low. So you will still want to buy water even if it doubles in price, because you need water. Like, that's a basic way of understanding how different goods have different elasticities, meaning that they have different vulnerabilities to how we respond to price changes. Great. I'm trying to slow down just in case there are any immediate questions to this part. Otherwise, let us move on. For this one, I'll just give you a little chance to think. Have any of you seen it before? Does it seem familiar? Do you know what it is? And you can reply in the chat if you don't mind. No, big no. You also don't study math? Like, is this scary? I hope not. Sorry, rolling up my sleeves. Let's see. So what is this? More specifically, this is a very basic form of a GDP function. So the GDP function, or GDP in general, stands for gross domestic product. Basically, probably a term you've heard a lot, but to clarify, the gross domestic product is kind of the accumulation of all value that is being produced within a country within a certain time frame. So usually we measure GDP on a yearly basis. So we usually have GDP per year. So we have how much money is there being produced stuff within a year in a certain country. Yeah, so it's just basically how much money do they make in terms of their goods. And this is how you calculate it. And I think this is a really, really good way to get a basic understanding of economics and how like different factors influence the economy. So to elaborate on this function, the C, like the first letter, is just the GDP, right? The next C, so this C, is the consumption. So that basically means how much do everyday people go out and buy stuff for within a year. Then you have investments. So this is the money that we don't buy directly goods for, but these are things that we, for instance, can be saving. That is also what we call investments in this sense. So the money you don't spend, but the money you have in your bank are still counted as investments. But also, if you buy stocks, it's not consumption, it is investments. Then you have the G, which stands for government spending. So government spending is anything that is within the budget of the nations or within the budget of the state. So what is things that are within the public sector? This could be things like healthcare, but it could also be investments into new infrastructure or things like that. And then the X minus M is exports minus imports. So basically, either you have an export deficit or a surplus. Most Western and most European countries, as far as I know, have a surplus on this account, meaning that they export more things than they import. So they make money via international trade. That's just, that's very general for our place in the world, but for some nations, it's very different. And yeah, so these things in total make up the GDP function. Now, this means that this is, as I said, like kind of the entirety of the value that is being produced within a country within a given year. That means if you have certain functions or certain debates where you talk about, oh, consumption does this, then just try to remind yourself of this thing to see, are there any other places where we could have a debate? So can we debate stuff not about how people spend their money, but about how people save their money? Or could we take the debate into a place where it's more about how the government spends money rather than how individuals spend money? So it's not necessarily that you're going to be debating the GDP function in any way, but it can help to remind you that there are different ways that the economy comes together and different elements that make up the economy as a whole. Okay, great. I hope that's, once again, understandable and useful. So yeah, I'll just move on quickly, but yeah, remember to shoot if you have any questions. When we talk about GDP, we talk about the real GDP versus the nominal GDP. Again, if I could see you, I would ask if you knew the difference, but since I can't, I'll just really quickly say that the nominal GDP means that it is just the number. So if Denmark in total has a GDP of 2,000 billion kroner, Danish kroner in a year, and the next year they have 2,100 billion Danish kroner in a year, then those are just nominal numbers. Now the real GDP is ones we have adjusted for inflation. So is the concept of inflation like not how it happens, but what it is? Is that understandable to you guys? Is that something you know? Yes, great. So you know that real GDP is adjusted for inflation. So money in the 1970s were worth less than they are today. So those numbers would be significantly lower or significantly different if we just compared them on the nominal. That's why we compare them on the real GDP. And typically we also talk about GDP growth rates. And yeah, generally speaking, a lot of developed countries have an idea that a natural or a good growth rate per year is around 2%. That's not to say that there isn't evidence that more or less can still be very good, but a GDP growth rate of 2% means that your inflation is probably not too bad and that your economy is constantly evolving. Great. Now, note also that in economics, we talk a lot about GDP as if it is like the golden standard of everything, and that's the only thing we can compare things with. I think there are a lot of alternative measures, and these are just two very plain alternative measures. But there are a lot of alternative measures as to how you measure the value or the state of the economics within a country, rather than GDP. In this slide, I'm just suggesting GDP per capita. So basically just, you have the entire GDP and you just divide it with the amount of people in the country. Or the purchasing power parity, which might be a little more interesting. That is where you say, how much money do people have and how much can they buy for that money? And then you have that as a relative amount that you compare with other, within years or with other countries. But it could also be things like just happiness or mental health, or it could be gender parity or things like this. That can be really interesting ways of measuring economic output and economic value. Great. Moving on. One more thing about concepts. I think there's a tendency in economics to think that everything is perfect and perfectly understandable. We typically talk about perfect markets as if markets are this perfect system where everything just happens naturally, and where it is sometimes best if we just let the market be. That is not necessarily an assumption that people can prove or disprove, but just to say that it is an underlying assumption in a lot of basic economics that things work perfectly on their own. We also have to assume in a lot of economic studies, and like if we want to calculate on economics, we often assume that there's what we call perfect information, so that people have all the information accessible to them, and that they can make very smart decisions, rational decisions based on these things. When we refer, or like when we transfer this concept to people, we call it homo economicus, basically saying that people will make very rational decisions and their only values are to optimize their wealth or to optimize their income, so to say. A very good example of this is, for instance, when we talk about interest rates, which we will in a second, we usually say that if interest rates are very low, then people will be encouraged to spend money because it is not as valuable for them to save it in the bank. But the problem with this is that we probably don't all of us probably don't always know what the interest rate is, and we probably also don't all know what the inflation rate is. So even if this information is available to us, we probably don't use it and we probably don't think about it. So there is a lot of these things that you can go into when you talk about or debate economics as to how it is that even if we have these systems and they in theory work, they don't always work in practice. All right. Moving on to monetary and fiscal policy. Do you know the difference, first of all? Yes, no in the chat. Not really. Okay, cool. That's a good place to start. So we'll start with talking about monetary policy, and then we'll talk about fiscal policy afterwards. So monetary policy, in essence, is what central banks or national banks do. So it has very little, if not nothing, to do with the parliaments and the politicians. It's usually completely separated from politics and from elected officials, and it only takes place within central banks or national banks. There are two things that they do in terms of monetary policy. One refers to interest rates and the other to money supply. So let's talk about them separately. Interest rates, first of all. As I just alluded to before, there is a general tendency or belief, which is, pretty much 99% of the time true, that the lower the interest rates are, the more spending people and businesses are encouraged to do. That is because if you don't make money by saving the money in the bank, you might as well, spend the money right now. Alternatively, it's also about loans, so you can switch it around. Say if it's cheap to take a loan, people will take a loan, but if it's very expensive to take a loan, you're less encouraged to take a loan. So generally speaking, the lower the interest rates, the increased spending. The opposite is of course also true. So the higher the interest rates, you decrease the incentive to spend money. Now, up until when was it, like 2017 or something like that, there has been this concept of what we call the zero lower bound, which is basically the idea that you can't have an interest rate that is below zero, because then essentially you would have to pay money to people who are borrowing money, right? So that's the number one reason why you didn't think that it was possible to have an interest rate at below zero. So the zero lower bound became this kind of myth that scared a lot of economists away from lowering the interest rates when essentially that was what they should have probably done to make sure that they were responding adequately to what society and the economy needed. Now, I don't know if this was the same in Estonia, but largely from the European central banks, probably also in Estonia, and in Denmark especially, we did have a period of time where the interest rate was below zero, at least for some type of loans or some type of investments. So that means that people were getting money for borrowing and had to pay more money than they were getting to have things invested. So you might have to pay a fee to have your money in the bank. So basically what we've seen is that the zero lower bound essentially was not true, like it wasn't a true thing to be scared of, because we were still able to adjust our economy accordingly, and people were not as quick to like respond to these things as possible as we thought that they could be. Once again, this goes back to like the Homo economicus concept, because theoretically you would say that if people have to pay money to have money in the bank, then everyone would take their money out of banks. And then, of course, there's a fear that if no one has money in the banks, then we have, first of all this very impractical cash lying around. And second of all, you have banks that have no money. So basically, banks would have to go bankrupt. But as we saw, it's also very impractical for people to have, like, I don't know how much money people have, but just have thousands and thousands of kroner or dollars or euros lying around in cash. So it's impractical, but it's also a big bother to go out and take it out of the bank and like figure these things out. So the zero lower bound scare was not really that relevant anyways. All right, so the money supply. So the second thing, like the second tool within monetary policies. So interest rates and adjusting interest rates are the first thing that you can do to adjust economic differences. So if you have an economy where you think things are going too slow, for instance, like if you think not enough money are being spent and the economy is generally decreasing, you would want to lower interest rates to increase spending, to increase the flow of the economic system, so to say. That's one way you can do these things, right? Another way of responding to economic needs is via the money supply. Now, the general comment that I think, or like the general question that we probably all wondered at some point in our life is like, why don't we just print more money? If we need money, why don't we just print it and give it to poor people, or just, use it to bail out countries or governments that are in debt or things like that? Now, the reason that we don't do this is because of inflation. Because if we do this, then the value of the money decreases. So that means you could have as many notes and coins as you want, but the value of that will not increase just because you have more notes and more coins. There is kind of like a fixed amount that belongs to that nation or that exists in kroner. So that amount is fixed, and no matter the relation to the current or like to the notes or the coins, that amount kind of stays the same. So what do they do with the money supply instead? Because they don't just print more money. What they do is that they either buy bonds or they sell bonds. So when you buy bonds, you increase the money supply. When you sell bonds, you decrease the money supply. And just to be clear and to put it very simply, a bond is basically like a stock, but it's a stock in a country. So instead of having a stock in a company, have a stock in a country. They're usually not very risky, and they're usually very long term. Which makes it easier for people to invest in these kind of things. And there are two different ways, if you really want to nerd this, there are two different ways that you can buy bonds. You can buy them off of people, and then we call it quantitative easing. So people who already own stocks in or bonds in Estonia, you buy the bank goes in and buys these stocks from the people. Or you can buy it off of the government. So the government issues more bonds, and then the national bank or the central bank goes in and buys these stocks. So quantitative easing or monetization. It's not because you're going to need these terms, but sometimes debaters like to throw them around. And then it's just kind of nice to know what it is, so that you're not scared about not entering into a debate because someone says quantitative easing. Yeah, because all you need to know is quantitative easing or monetization refers to increasing the money supply via buying bonds off of things or people. Great. Moving on. So why do you do these things? Why is it good to have these kind of tools? As I said before, it is generally because you want to respond or change a pathway that the economy is going down. So it's because you want to do something. You want the economy to behave differently than the road that it is on right now. So you're either doing what we call contractionary or expansionary monetary policies. So contractionary monetary policies you do when you want the economy to go slower. When it's going too fast, when inflation is going too high, you would want to employ contractionary measures, sort of to like slow it down and decrease the economy. On the other hand, when the economy is going very slow, for instance, in economic setbacks or during like recessions, you want to employ expansionary monetary policies. So that means you want to lower the interest rates, you want to increase the money supply. That would be expansionary. And the other would be contractionary. So that's why you do these things. And when we talk about inflation, which is like the next point, as I said, which is also true for the GDP growth rate, we usually have 2%. For inflation, 2% is also typically a pretty good growth rate. And even more so when we talk about inflation, it's very difficult to say whether or not a 4% inflation would automatically mean that the country is going downhill, and that very much so depends on the state of the country and the type of economy that it is. So very developed economies are typically worse off at handling higher rates of inflation because innovation sometimes is just slower. So that means more money is not being produced as quickly to keep up with inflation, aka rising prices. And then there are some really interesting elements or linkages between inflation and unemployment that I'll show you in a second. But just lastly, that's just the concept of hyperinflation, which is just generally, once again, when you have too much inflation too quickly so that people can't respond, prices are increasing, and people can't buy what they want to buy. Yeah, good. So the relationship between unemployment and inflation can be described via the Phillips curve. And I didn't bother to like make this nice myself, so I'm just going to put it in a picture, right? It's an economic concept that states that inflation and unemployment have stable and inverse relationships. So that what does that mean? That basically means, do you guys know what it means by now? Do I have to explain it? Not really to you know what it means, or not really, you don't have to explain it. You don't know. Okay, great. So an inverse relationship means that when one is high, the other one is low. So when inflation is very low, you generally say that you would have higher unemployment. And when you have high unemployment, when you have high inflation, you have low unemployment. So in general, the way that the European Union is working right now is that we have higher rates of inflation, which means we have lower rates of unemployment. Now, if our economy was more stable, quote unquote, and we had lower rates of inflation, we would also have higher rates of unemployment. Now, I'm telling you this because it's good to know that low inflation rates is not a goal in and of itself, and it should be relative to what we want from the economy. So if we want people to be employed and we think that unemployment is a very, very big issue, then we should accept to have lower rates of employment at the risk of having higher rates of inflation. But if it's more important to us that we have, we can bear our social system or our welfare system can bear a certain amount of unemployment, then maybe it's more important for the economy to have lower rates of inflation at the risk of having higher rates of unemployment. So it just goes opposites, right? So that's how you have to remember it. High inflation, low unemployment, low inflation, high unemployment. Great. Right, I'll move on now, but just continue to ask if you have more questions about that. Cool. And yeah, once again, hyperinflation and deflation. Why is it that we don't really like these things? Why do we want a stable rate of little to like 0 to 2% of inflation? When we have hyperinflation, things happen too quickly. We become insecure, and generally speaking, our confidence, both in the economy and in the fact that our institutions will respond adequately, decreases, and we don't necessarily know how things are going to happen, right? So that makes us insecure. And insecurity is like one of the worst things when it comes to economics. If you don't know what your money is worth tomorrow, you will be completely scared. The only reason society works is because I know that the money I have now will also help me pay the rent that I will, be charged with next month. Because I know the value of my money is not going to drastically change. Hyperinflation also typically leads to shortages. Think, for instance, the COVID crisis is a good example, even if it's not an example of hyperinflation. But just to say, when people don't know what's going to happen, they rush and they buy things that they don't need, and that typically leads to a lot of shortages. And then once again, when we talk about inflation, hyperinflation also, there's an unequal harm. So typically the people who have a lot of money are not as hard hit by prices increasing 4 or 10%. But people who don't have a lot of disposable income, aka money left over once they've paid all their bills, these people will be very hardly hit by things like hyperinflation. Now, deflation can generally be bad because the economy is just getting smaller. It can also affect the confidence we have in our institutions and politicians. And we can fear that it leads into like what we call a deflationary spiral. So just basically the economy will keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And when the economy is getting smaller, that means people are not selling as much, which means people don't have as much money to buy things for. So that's why it spirals downwards. Great. I don't know if we have a lot of time to do this, so I will just rhetorically ask the question. This is an intuition test that I also brought to economist students, and I don't think that they answered it adequately either. So even if this is difficult for you, don't worry about it. I took this from the Manchester Debating Union's video about economics. Really good video, I highly recommend it. But what did they say when they talked about inflation? They say, how does it happen? So they said, people have more money. That means people want to buy more things. That means companies want to increase their production, and therefore they need to hire people. That means workers get to ask for higher wages, and that means companies need to raise prices. And then they say that this is not a bad thing because the price rises, but the salaries rises too. Great. Sorry, I don't know why that was so difficult for me to read. But the most important thing in this thing here is that they generally assume that there is an equal power balance between companies and workers, which we probably know is not true, right? So it's probably true that when people have more money, they want to buy more things, and that means companies want to increase their production and that they need to hire people. Now, the next sentence, workers get to ask for higher wages. Sure, workers get to ask, but it's not always sure that workers are the ones who are getting higher wages or higher wages. Because as we've seen, even in the COVID crisis, the what do we call it? The salaries and the bonuses of CEOs has risen extensively, while the people on the lower levels of the working class have not seen the same rises in their disposable income or in their income in general. So that basically just means that even if companies get to ask for higher prices, the people who are skimming the cream of this is not necessarily the workers. So that's why inflation can still be bad, even if it is, explained in this sense, because it is not a symmetrical system, and there isn't an equal power balance between workers and people. Yeah, good. Let's talk briefly about fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is, or let's put it firstly in relation to monetary policy, right? So monetary policy is what happens when banks do something. So national banks and central banks. Fiscal policy is what happens when the government does something. Basically only the government. So that is what your politicians choose to do. It can also be local politicians, but any politician, what they choose to do for econ or for their economic policies, that's what we call fiscal policy. So two main ways that they choose to do fiscal policy. One is via government spending. So that could mean, your local municipality builds a new road or they make a new park. Then they spend money and they hire people. And that means that they are doing some sort of monetary exchange for something. This has very direct effects. It typically leads to people being either employed or unemployed because they either hire or, let's say they invest in new projects. That means they have to employ people to make these projects. So people are very directly and very quickly getting paid to do new things. Alternatively, you have taxes, or you can have more or less progressive taxes. I'm not going to turn this into a whole tax talk, but if you want the perspective of someone who lives in one of the most taxed countries in the world, I will be happy to give it to you afterwards. But taxing or taxation usually have more indirect effects, even though we generally assume that people respond very rapidly to tax changes. So saying if your tax rate increases a lot, you will have to pay a lot more taxes. You would probably work less to avoid paying, an extra tax or something. That's generally what we assume in economics. But for a lot of people, it is practicalities that decide these things rather than the tax bracket that they're in. So taxation at large has more indirect effects than government spending has. Now note that fiscal policy in general and also in debate world is very political and it's very bureaucratic. So it's not easy. It's usually a lot slower of a process, but it can be something that's very good to combine with monetary policies. So if you have very big recessions, you would probably not see either only monetary responses or only fiscal responses. You would see a combination of both. So the government would both go in and try to see, okay, can we make it easier for the citizens via tax reliefs? Can we make it easier for the citizens via, increasing a lot of our spending, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So that's fiscal policy at large. Now, the historical background to fiscal policy, I think, is very interesting because in the last, let's say, maybe 100 years, we've seen two very different comments on this. 200 years maybe. All right, you're not econ students, so I'm not going to worry about if I say that correct, but it's something like that. We have two very big people in this history that we can refer to. One of them is John Maynard Keynes, and the other one is Adam Smith. So John Maynard Keynes is very famous because he was basically the founder of a new way of seeing economics. We call it Keynesian economics. So what his thesis was that when government spending or when governments choose fiscal policy that is very expansionary, when they choose to go and directly impact the economy via government spending, that means people more directly get the money in hand, and then they more directly are able to buy things via that money. So what he called it was a multiplier effect. So the money is now in circulation much quicker, which means that it will be in more times, like the same circulation more times. So basically you have the same $100 bill. First, it's being spent by the government. Then it's being spent by the contractor. That contractor buys an apple. So now the $100 bill is at the grocery store, etc., etc. So the same $100 bill can make a huge difference for the economy. That's what he called the multiplier effect. So just saying, because when the government spends the money directly, we get a lot more out of that spending. So what he was essentially promoting was government interference and government spending. He wanted a very active in fiscal policy. That's what he wanted from governments. He wanted them to be very progressive, and he wanted them to spend a lot of money. He thought that was the best thing governments could do for the economy. Now, on the complete other hand, one of the liberalists and maybe neoliberalists of the world is Adam Smith, who believed much more in what he called the invisible hand. So the invisible hand theory basically evolves around the perfect market. So again, if you remember what we talked about before with perfect everythings, when the market is perfect, it operates alone. So Smith would be saying that everything Keynes says is incorrect. He doesn't want the government to spend a lot of money. He doesn't want the government to be very involved in the market, because the market works optimally when we don't interfere with it. The market corrects itself. That's basically what his idea were. So you can see that you have two very opposing views, and this has led to very different political or economic, how do you say that? It has led to two very different economies around the world. So some economies are much more Keynesian, and some of the economies are much more liberalist in their traditions, which makes it very hard to break out of certain ways of doing things. Yeah, so that's basically the general ideologies, or two main economic ideologies behind how we adjust or how we decide on fiscal policy. And probably, I don't know if this is the same in Estonia, but a lot of governments are usually made up of people who believe in one or both of these things, and then you have parliaments that have to agree between very different ideological backgrounds. Yeah, moving on. So I have a little bit about banks because as of yet, I've only talked about banks like very briefly, and I've just called it central banks or national banks. Let's have a little bit more differentiation in this, because banks are a huge actor, especially in debates, and sometimes they're thought of as this scary entity where no one really knows what they do. So central banks, the two most important from a very Western perspective, central banks are the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is what we call the American Central Bank. So, yeah, just so you know. But the European Central Bank is basically the bank that decides on all European monetary policies. I know this because I was in Estonia not too long ago, but can you just remind me, you guys have the euro, right? Yes, great. Okay, so you guys have the euro. So you are directly impacted by the European Central Bank. So the European Central Bank sets a common policy for the entire Eurozone area. So that basically means that you guys would have the same interest rates as you would have in other countries that have the euro. Now, this can be challenging because, of course, sometimes you don't have the same needs as other countries, but the Eurozone is then being seen as one large entity and one single entity by the European Central Bank. Just for reference, in case you're interested, Denmark has our own currency, but our currency is what we call pegged to the euro. So that essentially means that we have our own currency and we have its own name, and we still have to exchange it, but it acts and does the exact same ways or the exact same thing that the euro does. So what is the difference then between central banks and national banks? Now, the national banks would then be the banks that are responsible for making sure that you have money in the country. So basically, they are the ones who print new money when it's necessary. They're also the ones who, call back Estonian or like Estonian euros if necessary. In Denmark, that means our national bank just basically implements central bank policies. So when the European Central Bank says that we have to do X, the Danish National Bank makes sure that X is done. Now, note that I've also differentiated between national banks and private banks. Private banks are, I'm trying to think of any international bank, but the only thing I can think of is like Bank of America, but you know what I mean, right? So private banks are where you have your credit cards. That's where you are customers. So this is for private individuals to go to. Sometimes they're government supported and they can be zombies, but just to say that's how they're private because they're usually used by private individuals or private companies. So a zombie is an entity that is only being kept alive via government funding. So because the government doesn't want the bank to fail, they sometimes give the bank more money to operate, and that means the bank is able to, sustain or financially sustain itself. I put a very big question mark after zombies, and I put a very big question mark after good or bad actors, because I think it is very both culturally dependent and also very locally dependent and framing dependent on how you see these private banks, whether or not they are good actors, whether or not they give out good loans and help good people, or if they give out bad loans and cause economic recessions. So that is largely up to you to define and think about, and yeah, just create your own relationship and thought about around banks. Cool. Now, the last slide that I have for you today, before I'm again very happy to take any questions if you have any, is about economic cycles and economic timeframes. We usually have, we call it booms and recessions, and then I think I forgot the word, or I couldn't realize if there was a word for what we call just stability. But booms, economic booms, are when the economy is thriving and going upwards. So GDP would be increasing, would probably have lower interest rates, would probably have a 2% inflation, stuff like that. Things are going well and people are getting richer. Recessions are when companies have to go bankrupt and we have too high interest rates, we have too high inflation, or we have too little government spending, or these kind of things. So basically, there's just not enough money going around, and the people who have money, they save money rather than spending money. Yeah, so that's how we differentiate between economic cycles. And there's like a tendency for these things to happen on a relatively steady interval. So we've had recessions now in 2007, 2008, and then we've had like the COVID recession. So maybe we can see something again happening in the next 5-10 years. That's interesting. Time will tell. I'm not going to pretend to predict that. And then lastly, what I'll mention is that we typically, and when you debate this specifically, you should differentiate between the time frame that you're debating in. So do you want your impacts to reach people in the short run, medium run, or long run? And the medium run is maybe a very economic thing to put in there. It's not always the case that in debates we discuss the medium run. So to clarify what these timeframes mean, in basic economics, and this can change depending on like anything from your lecturer to what type of business we're discussing. But the short run in economics is usually within 6 months or within a year. So it's not super short for some people, but within economics, that's a pretty short time frame. Now, a medium run is something within the 1 year to 5 years, and then the long run is something between 5 years and 10 years and plus. So when you make long run or long-term investments in economics, you don't expect these investments to pay off in the first decade almost. So that's how we differentiate these things. All right, this was very quick, but I also had a lot to go through. So I hope this I hope it made sense. If you have any like immediate dying questions, feel free to ask them now. Maybe you can also ask Marcus and he can try to help you. But yeah, 2 questions, great. Let me just read it. So do you have any recommendations for how to weigh economic growth against human impact? For example, speak in favor for degrowth in a climate change focused debate. Great. You can type the other question also, unless that is the same question, or like those are the 2 questions. So generally speaking, I think you have to consider that there is the economy and then there is the political economy for these things, right? So when you talk about speak in favor of degrowth, degrowth doesn't necessarily mean that people are worse off. That just means that we're not growing the economy to the same extent. Now consider your lives right now and consider if you or like your families would be content in the same economic situation for the rest of your lives. For a lot of people in our part of the world, especially when we debate climate change, the answer would be yes. Like we could probably live this way forever and not feel like we were significantly worse off than if the economy had continued to grow. So I think there is something inherently wrong with the question in the sense that you're framing it as if, it is an individual thing, that degrowth automatically means that individuals are worse off. I think the capitalist economy that we have right now, growth generally favors very developed countries or very specific people, and sometimes innovations, but you can also outframe that. Yeah, so I think at large, that's what I would change in that and make sure that you focus more on the 99% rather than the 1%. And then also don't be afraid to poke a hole in, or like how do you say that? Pop the balloon and tell people that degrowth is not something to be scared of, right? We should be scared when people start to lose their jobs. We should be scared when people can't afford things that they want to buy. But generally speaking, and especially in terms of climate change, the Western world could at large be happy in their situation as it is today. And the first part of the question was like weighing economic growth against human impact. Yeah, once again, I think you would never frame economic growth as something you do only for economic growth. You would always frame it as something you do for people's sake. So if you lose out on debates where some people claim a lot of economic or human impacts and you have to focus only on economic growth, then probably try to expand that and see what kind of economic growth am I talking about? Because go back to the GDP function, right? If you have a higher GDP, then that means you also have higher consumption rates or higher investment rates. And that basically just means that more people are also, using this kind of money. So that makes more people happy. Yeah. So the economy at large is also about people. Economics is essentially just about people. Never make it like a concept that no one deals with, and then there are people separately. Yeah. And then can you quickly re-explain why the inverse connection between inflation and unemployment exists? Yep, I can. So right now, I think I basically just said that it exists. I haven't really explained why it exists, but it's good to know that it exists, first of all. Now, the second reason that we think like that both empirically and theoretically that it makes sense. Let me just figure out a way to formulate this. Yeah, so basically, when inflation is high, that means a lot of stuff is going on in the economy. Economic activity is very high. So you can relate this to all the other aspects of that what I've talked about also, right? So inflation is high. That probably means you have, people are spending a lot of money, or more people are being employed, or companies are growing, things like this, right? So that generally makes things more expensive when people are doing well. So when people are doing well and things are more expensive and inflation is high, that means unemployment is low because there is a lot of economic activity. Basically, when inflation happens, if you think of it as like a wheel, when it starts to overheat, the economy, that is like the economy is the wheel. When the economy starts to overheat, inflation rises. And that can only happen because a lot of people are working. So because like the economy is very active, a lot of people are employed, and that means unemployment is low. And that also means the vice versa is true. Sorry that I'm like explaining this a little difficultly or poorly, I guess. But so when the economic activity is very low, there's just not a lot of companies, there's not a lot of jobs, there's not a lot of money being spent, and that means a lot of people are unemployed. Great. Does that answer it? Ah, okay, the Manchester thing. Yeah, let's talk about that again. Yeah, so basically the Manchester thing is like the reason that things work the way it works. The only problem I have with this is just the idea that workers are the ones who get higher wages. Everything else in this intuition pump stands very true. It's just the idea that workers, get the money that I think is false. Great. Unless you have any other questions, I'll at least stop my screen share. And yeah, I think it was a pleasure talking about econ. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. And yeah, tell Marcus if you want more econ workshops. Great. Have a great debate, everyone.